component of a successful, one very component of it, a very important component of a successful interview is that the person you're interviewing comes. And so far, Mark hasn't come, but he will be here, I'm sure, shortly. So, but let me start with my introduction. So, as I know many of you, welcome. Good to see you. For those I don't know and who might watch online later, I'm Eric Thompson. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont Center for Family Studies. For 25 years, we've been part of the National Bowen Family Systems Theory Network. And our mission is to strengthen families and society using a wonderful body of knowledge called Bowen theory or Bowen Family Systems Theory. Sometimes I call it Bowen Leadership Theory. Lately, when I'm talking to people who don't know about it, because I think it is a leadership theory. It's a theory of leadership, how to drive system change. And my guest today is going to be Dr. Mark Flinn. And I'm going to do a brief introduction to Mark. And while I'm at it, Roz, do we have Mark's cell? Maybe we should.
I don't, Eric. I mean, he's accepted the calendar invitation, and I was actually going to try to email him right now.
Okay, great. And it's only 2 minutes in, so I'm sure he's getting on. But I know many of you are familiar with Mark in his work. I feel fortunate to have been a part of the Bowen Network for a long time and to have made contact with the scientists that come in and are invited in. Bowen started a tradition of staying connected to the sciences, which is in very good shape. It's very strong. The Bowen Center continues to do it. And certainly one of the most special in that group is Dr. Mark Flinn. Bob, were you the person who brought Mark into the Bowen Network originally, Bob Noon, or did you find out about him from someone else?
No, he presented at Chicago first at our symposium. Yeah, I met Mark, I think in 1998 or 99 at a presentation he did. And then I later invited him to our symposium.
Yeah. And so I'm going to try to take a shot at introducing you to, or giving you a basic summary of what Mark's done. I know, again, many of you know this, but he got his Ph.D. in anthropology from Northwestern in 1983. So maybe he had some Chicago connections early on there. And then he became a professor at the University of Missouri eventually. He was there for 31 years. And since 2018, he's been at Baylor. And Mark has done something very interesting. He started going down to a small community on a small Caribbean island. And in his PhD, he's in anthropology, but he's a biomedical anthropologist. And he started taking saliva samples, I believe, from every single person in the village. Definitely a focus on child health, but he always had this family perspective. And so he's taking saliva samples, which allowed him to do many things, but I think the main focus was to measure the cortisol level in the saliva. And as most of you know, cortisol, the amygdala, which is a very important part of the brain's threat response sensing system, talks to cortisol.
Not good.
The amygdala signals.
I'm sorry, I'm just listening to something now.
Raz, can you help me mute that? The amygdala signals a cascade process through which the body produces cortisol, and it's considered the primary stress hormone. We could learn a lot about cortisol from Mark, but I'm giving you the high school version here. It stimulates tissue repair, and it downregulates or kind of shuts off anything non-essential to fight or flight. So it's a fight or flight hormone. And it's one that lasts longer than adrenaline, which is more about the immediate surge, but cortisol comes in and produces a more sustained surge. So it's a pretty good measure of stress. And of course, stress is not all bad. But that's the idea, is he was trying to get objective about stress in kids and to learn about the family and social processes that surround the stress response in people. And I'm sure we could talk for hours and hours with Mark Flinn about what he's discovered. So here's some pictures of Mark on the island, collecting data and geeking out here with his cortisol samples, very carefully done. So he started doing that, and he thought he would just be there for a short while. Well, that was over 30 years ago. The project started in '89, and it continues. Now I'm just going to check. Is Mark with us?
Not yet, Eric. I've sent him an email.
Okay. So I have all kinds of questions I'd like to ask Mark, but I want to tell you something that I've told. I did a presentation based on some of his work. And the first time I did it was it was kind of like a grandparents association that asked me to come talk to them. And I called it Grandma versus Trauma, to put a smile on their face. But it was based on the finding Mark had, that family structure has a really amazing impact on the variation in how people respond to traumatic events. So he tracks what goes on in this village, and he tracks traumatic events, which he has a careful definition of. And then he looks at what happens to a kid right after a traumatic event, what happens to their cortisol. And what he noticed was a tremendous variation in the cortisol response after a traumatic event from these kids. And he presented to us that a big factor was the family structure around the kid, which isn't going to be any surprise to people in the Bowen Network. And I remember he told us that one of a situation where it'd be more likely to be a big stress response was with a single mother who didn't have a relationship with her own mother. So interestingly, stable marriage was protective for kids when they had a traumatic event. And interestingly, even if the father was off island in the fishing industry 6 months of a year, it didn't change that much, which, kind of humbling to all of us dads to realize how unimportant we are. And but that he also shared that if the single mom had an active relationship with her mother, that it would have about the same protective factor as the intact family. So that's the grandma versus trauma story. Bob, I wonder if you'd be willing to, in a minute here, I'll put you on the spot and see if you'd be willing to share a little bit about your journey with Mark as we hopefully wait for Mark to get on.
Sure, I'd be happy to describe a little bit about my history with Mark. I know that I was a member of the Human Behavior and Evolution Society, and we're having their annual meeting at Northwestern in Chicago. And Barbara Smuts, who had presented at our meeting, a psychologist and a primatologist at the University of Michigan, suggested that I go hear Mark Flinn and his research. I didn't know anything about it at the time, but I was truly impressed, and I thought this is the kind of research that would be ideal for Bowen theory, because it is a longitudinal study at that time, it was probably in about its 15th or 16th year, looking at family structure, looking at the stress level, and having a physiological measure, not just the cortisol levels, but some of the immune system levels, the cytokine levels. So looking at overall the impact of family on the health of children, and he began by taking swabs of saliva from all the infants, and not only were they taking the saliva from the kids, but they were he had some assistants who lived in the village who would on a weekly basis record events in the family. So they would go around to each family in the village and get a reading on how they were doing in school, what their health was like, what kind of activities they were involved in. So the interesting thing about cortisol, of course, is it's like an energy hormone. If you get involved in if you're running or in intense play, your cortisol level goes up. So you have to differentiate between increase in cortisol level when it's a stress as opposed to when it's an energy requirement to mobilize the body to deal with the need for energy. But anyways, I went up to Mark afterwards and asked him about the paper, and he gave me a couple of copies. And then next week I emailed him and asked him if he would be willing to present at our symposium. So I think that was 1999. And while he was there, he said, why don't you come down and visit Dominica? You'd be interested in it. And so I took him up on it. So my first time down there, I think, was 99. And I've made 9 trips down there over the years. I was just there just at the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020. And I was there this time. I hadn't been there for about eight or 9 years, but he wanted to look at the impact of a traumatic event. So Hurricane Maria hit the island head on. It's the first island that it hit. It was a Category 5 hurricane and basically leveled the village. It destroyed most of the vegetation. All the trees were down. Most of the housing was gone. A helicopter the next morning that went over the village said all the residents of the village were lost. As it turned out, nobody died in that hurricane, which was remarkable. But he wanted to do a study 2 years after that traumatic event to see what impact it had on the family. He had been staying in touch, and he and some colleagues made an effort to get supplies and food and some medical stuff to the village before that. So I went down there in, again, March of 2020. And I was hoping I could do more in terms of research, but I'm not really a researcher. But my goal was to get multi-generational family histories from the families that I could interview. So overall, over the years, I've interviewed 23 families. And I got, I think, 20 out of those 23 families 2 years ago when I was down there. But it's anecdotal information. It's just rich in terms of the kind of research study that Mark has done. It's really a kind of groundbreaking study, which has continued now. I think it's in its 29th or maybe 30th year. And he's just an incredibly great researcher, but not only a good researcher, but his capacity to relate to the people in that village is pretty remarkable.
I always remember you talking about that, and I can well imagine because Mark has a presence, but I think they're very appreciative of him. And it's been a great partnership, really.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing to maintain a relationship like that over 30 years, because you can imagine there'd be some people and residents of the village who would start getting suspicious about what this anthropologist was trying to do with the information he was getting about their village. And he was able to keep relating to really everyone in the village, very much like a Bowen theory clinician in terms of his ability to relate to individuals, and sense when there was some anxiety developing about his study and being able to engage people.
I remember he presented one time on the cricket teams play each other in these villages, and he studied testosterone and the different variations. And I remember the detail, Bob, that testosterone didn't go up when a male was talking to his friend's girlfriend, but it did go up when he was talking to the other team's girlfriend. So I just want to thank you for a sec, Bob Noonan. Introduce Bob. Dr. Bob Noonan is the editor of the Family Systems Journal and one of the founders of the Chicago Center. And when Bob found out that Mark was going to be on, he made sure to make the time. And Bob, thanks for pinch hitting here. I think at 15 after now, we could guess that we possibly will not have Mark Flinn on today. And if any of you feel, you'd like to get off, I won't be offended at all. And
I could, Eric, I could try and call him now and see if that.
Why not? Yeah, if you got his number. I think maybe Roz, did you already call him? But Bob might have a different number. Who knows?
I think I called the office. That's the number I could find.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, no, that would be great, Bob.
If Bob has his cell. So if you feel you want to wait, and we'll circle back around and get another one with Mark. But if you want to stick around, and if you're up for it, Bob, and maybe some of my other colleagues here, Lori Laster's probably thought a lot about Mark Flinn, we could just keep going and have a conversation about Mark's work. So while Bob's doing that, I'm just going to share a little bit more, take care of a little bit more business to tell you some things that are coming up. I just had a very long interest in marriage, and I feel like I want to talk some more about it. So we're going to do one on March 17th where Roz is going to interview me about what my thoughts are about sustainable and sparky marriage. And you're welcome to come and ask questions and get in on the conversation about that. And then I'm going to do another event in April. We do a lot of free events, but we also want to put in some that are a little bit longer and that folks can pay for. Helps us keep the lights on. And this is sort of new thinking for me, the differentiated universal self. I can tell you a bit more about that later if you want. And then one of our faculty members, Kemi Kelton, has put together a really clear and inspiring and just very wise, I think, presentation on the development of a Bowen-oriented therapist, Bowen theory in the therapy room. And Kami was interested in putting that out to a wider audience. So that's going to be available online in May, near the end of May. And I'll just mention now, instead of doing it later, that we really appreciate those who support us. We really have run for years on a lot of volunteer energy, but we part of what we do now is through the support of wonderful donors. It's very encouraging and really helps us pay for this event and the time it takes to do what we do. And it the picture there is. Roz put it together is, that's our house, say the White House, BCFS house, and all the homes that get impacted by Bowen theory, by, the work that the therapists we train do in our training program and folks like you. I think probably people who spend their lives doing this kind of work underestimate the amount of impact on the houses, because if you touch one life with Bowen theory and help them think systems, you're really impacting their whole family and hopefully future generations. So that said, Bob, did you get through?
I got his voicemail.
Okay, good. Well, maybe he'll jump on, who knows? But Bob, if you don't mind, do you mind just chatting a little more about him?
No, not at all. I don't know where to begin with it. I guess the thoroughness of his research, and again, he probably has 100 papers, I would think. I would encourage people to look him up. You can get his papers through Google Scholar. He found this village, which is a very remote village and a remote island. So the village of Dominica is been saved from tourism because it's a very volcanic island. It's called the Nature Island. It doesn't have any sandy beaches. So it's a relatively poor island, or it was, and still is, I think. And it doesn't attract too much in the way of tourism, but it's really an incredibly beautiful island. And he was searching for a place to do his research study and went to this island and went to one of the most remote villages on the island. And he said, fortunately, he first made contact with a woman who pretty much operated as one of the leaders of the village. It's an interesting village because there was no running water or electricity, and there's no structure in terms of medical care or no political offices involved. It operates very much like a pre-industrial village where nobody owns land in the village, but each family is allotted a certain land to farm. And if they leave the village, the land reverts back to the village and a new family gets that land. And so they subsist mostly on some crops and fishing on the island. In terms of his research, I guess his interest had to do with family and had to do with the impact of the family on the health of children. So the cortisols that he collected were only of the children and not the adults. But for a while, because it's important to establish a baseline, they were collecting saliva from every child twice a day for, I think, over a month to get this baseline of cortisol levels of the children, because there is a lot of individual variation. And then to get the circadian rhythms, because the cortisol levels change for individuals over the course of a day. And he has always been able to attract a number of researchers who go down there with him to help him with the effort over the years. I don't know where to go from there, Eric.
Well, I might ask you a few questions just to see, Bob, like, have there been particular findings that you recall or that you may have used in your work with clients at times or in your teaching that you think are pretty fascinating, like the one I shared there about, do you remember that one about, he shared that with us once at the Bone Center about this incredible variation in the family structure and the cortisol profile?
Yeah, well, it certainly supports Bowen theory in terms of the value of extended family. So you get a full range. It's the village itself was founded in the 1800s by 6 families. So the village itself, there's a high level of interrelatedness among families and genetics, so there's a lot of cohesion among these large extended families, but there are still families that become isolated and more withdrawn. And you could pretty clearly see, and I think the data supports it, that the families in which mothers are less isolated from the larger extended family, their children do better at least in terms of their stress levels. So, and the other thing that was so important, it was pretty clear, I think most clinicians know that, but the importance of grandmothers and the value that they serve in terms of, as I would see it, being a resource to their daughters or sons, as well as their grandchildren.
Yeah, as I put it together for my presentation, the presence of the grandmother almost completely canceled out the traumatic event, the impact of the traumatic event. It was quite dramatic.
Yeah, you mentioned the structure of the family. So he looked at 2-parent families. He was looking at cortisol levels in the children. So he looked at 2-parent families, single parents, single mothers, but who were a grandmother lived in the home, single mothers who's did not have contact with the extended family. As you mentioned, there was two-parent families in which the father was away for at least half of the year. And then combined families where each parent brought children from a previous relationship into the new family. So it was just interesting. It sort of fell out the way you would expect, except as you mentioned that families in which the father was away for more than 6 months of the year, living in another country and working, that those children had just slightly higher levels of cortisol, but not that much more than the other two-parent families. And you can interpret that a lot of different ways. My own interpretation was that it makes a difference for mother in terms of her own sense of isolation if she has a mate, even if the mate isn't there. And it may have been some slight financial benefit as well. But I think that connection itself is important, even though the person wasn't physically present.
Yeah. Thanks, Bob. And if anything else pops to mind that you remember from his findings, and let me ask others too, because many people on this call, Priscilla Friesen and Lori Lassiter, for example, have been following Mark's work to some degree for years. Is there anything anybody else would like to put in that you remember about his findings? Lori, you're muted, but go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I'm just curious. Well, it's just so fascinating that the child doesn't have to have the direct relationship with the grandparent. The parents having that connection makes such a difference. And I just think that, like Bob was saying, this backs up so much in Bowen theory, the family as a unit. But I just have a question about, maybe a broader question about grandmothers. And I'm wondering how much difference it makes if a grandmother is actually on site, because many of us have adult children who live in different parts of the country. How important is it, and what difference does it make? I wonder if you are familiar with any data on that, if the grandmother does live in the home or she lives in the same town, or is she, 2,000 or 3,000 miles away, but keeps in touch by phone and yearly or twice yearly visits?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think I suspect we would hear from Mark that there's a lot of variation in this. But Lori, I just think that one detail about the fathers who were off-site on fishing boats 6 months a year maybe speaks to this.
Yeah.
I always thought that was kind of amazing. And Bob, if I'm following you, that was the only piece of that surprised Mark. Like the rest of it was about what you would expect, that more stress in the single parent who wasn't connected to a mom and so forth.
Yeah, I don't know if it surprised Mark or not. I never asked him about that. I was just surprised myself when I saw that.
Yeah.
And go ahead, Lori.
Well, just the other thing that interests me a lot is what you said earlier, Eric, about the young man not having a physiological arousal with his friend's girlfriend. And I think that really speaks to, which Mark is so good at, looking at the social relationships govern to a degree or to a large degree our physiology. It's just a remarkable detail.
The other thing I remember, so Mark has a very big perspective. He, I think he's very interested in the work of a ethnographer named Napoleon Shagnon, who he brought to the University of Missouri. And he shared this, Lori, that he said, he said, what's the distinguishing feature of humans versus other mammals is that they have beers together after the cricket match. And he presented that doesn't happen in the other primate groups where you two troops meet. It's generally a pretty, actually amazingly bloody situation. And that's something that Jane Goodall discovered, that they actually, some of the chimps there in Gombe would form war parties at times and go to war against chimp troops that were just kind of over the valley. And that shocked people because they thought that chimps were, this kind of idyllic, peaceful species. And I remember too, learning from her book that she was really attacked when she first presented those facts. People were very upset about it, which is just interesting, the emotionality that people bring to facts.
Another,
go ahead. Yeah.
Sorry. Another observation that Mark made, and it was actually at a symposium when the auditorium was full of people. And he said that this is unique among humans, that males and females are able to be present together without a lot going on the side, as would be going on in a large male-female group of chimps and other primates. I just found that very interesting, and he pointed out how important that is.
One of the things that I think is valuable in this kind of information is that it might point towards the highest level of functioning for humans. Like if we could take those sort of details and go even further, we might see a picture of where we're headed evolutionarily. And this might be a moment where, Bob, if you wanted to, in a minute, you could share a little bit about something you've been sharing, your study of cognition and how it varies among different species. And guess what? Mark Flynn's coming in right now. I think we're just about to have Mark arrive. Hey, Mark.
Hey, everybody.
Good to see you. Good timing.
Well, I'm a little bit late. I apologize.
You are late, but that's all right, because we've just been having a good discussion. So we've got about, 30 plus members of the Bowen community on this call. And your friend Bob Noon is here. And many of us who've heard a lot of talks by you and read your papers over the years. And I didn't mention this, that Mark was given a special award by the Bowen Center because his research was so helpful in our effort to understand the family as a system. And I remember that, Mark, when they gave you that award, that was a special day.
It sure was.
Yeah. And since then we've been chatting.
I had no idea. It completely surprised me. It was
totally
wonderful.
Surprised you.
Yeah.
Since then we've been talking some about your findings about the protective influence of grandmothers on traumatic events, and your findings about, I just was sharing with them what you shared with us about distinguishing feature of humans is they have beers after the cricket match.
Yeah.
Did I get it right?
Well, yeah, it's an amazing cricket field there, right on the ocean. Real home field advantage.
And you've studied, if I'm correct, kind of testosterone levels in these cricket scenes that happen between different villages. Is that right?
Yep, that is right. Yeah, now we're getting interested in some other chemical messengers like oxytocin. And we have some new tools, video cameras that the computer can take input from and decipher emotional responses. So I can look at a group of children and feed the video in from each of their faces, and in real time have it analyze how the children are emotionally responding to one another, which is pretty cool. And they've got pulse rate monitors and a bunch of other health stuff now too that I hope will make life better for people in that wonderful community.
Mark, I wanted to ask you what's been inspiring lately, or what have you discovered that you think would be interesting to us lately?
Wow. Well, I'm currently involved in this big project where we're looking at 22 different cultures. And our topic is what's called interdependence. So how it is that individuals need each other, rely upon one another for support and help, and to measure that level of stuff that's going on. And then to see if it matches up with their pro-sociality and their willingness to cooperate with one another. The logic being, I'm going to help you a lot. You're my really good friend, Eric, because a tornado could come and, take my house away, and you'd be there for me. So that's kind of the logic behind it. And we're trying to see if there's any real substance to whether or not interdependence and need for help from others engenders a more pro-social, a more cooperative environment. And I'm really interested, of course, in how kids develop these virtues. Where does that come from? Because they can go down different paths. And the high road it's a pretty good place to be. So, whatever we can find out about that, I'm pretty excited with.
I'm guessing you tell us that when you look at the data of the kids on the high road, more pro-social kids, their stress profile is much more favorable to long-term health. And I'm wondering what else you've learned about it, about this question you just asked, what supports that high road for kids?
Well, I'm going down in a couple of weeks on my birthday, back down to Dominica. So hopefully we'll know more. I'll be better able to answer that question
okay. Yeah.
than I can right now.
Yeah. Mark, would you mind sharing with us some of the significant findings just about family structure and health, which I think, that's broadly, you've been studying that for a long time, right? In a very careful way.
Well, it really jumped out at me. So, initially we were interested in just sort of describing physiological responses of children to their environment, particularly their social environment. But very quickly became apparent that the most salient environment for children in that community was their family environments. And they can be pretty complex. So it's not at all like your standard suburban American family neighborhood setup. Everybody's related to everybody else. And there are a lot of potential sources of what we call alloparenting, or, help from relatives like aunts. Siblings can be pretty important as well. But having a stable, supportive family is it's a good thing for a child. They don't have to be so worried about all the different contingencies that could put them in a very bad place, because they can count on any number of relatives to be there of whatever their need. It could be a hug, could be a word of advice about how to deal with your girlfriend, could be insight as to how to get a job, how to get along with a teacher. Children have a lot to deal with. And it's really great when they've got counsel. and family is pretty key. You know, your friends and your peers can help in certain domains, but yeah, kids who've got real solid family background and yeah, it doesn't have to be your typical nuclear family. Kids can get support from a wide range of different family systems.
The question came up earlier. Do you have any speculations or do you know any science that would help us understand how important is it for the grandparent to be living in the same town? You know, in America, we have a lot of, you know, parents, grandparent live on the other coast, you know. What do you think about that, Mark?
Yeah, that's rough because it's certainly a novel environment. Our ancestors, when they reached that life history stage of being a grandparent, 40, 50, 60 years of age, it would be very common for them to be in close spatial, maybe even co-residency with their grandchildren. And that system, it's not just the grandparent to grandchild, because the grandparents are there for their children who are the parents. And so particularly for a mother to have her mom in close proximity to help her deal with the kids and to get advice. And, you know, when she needs a break, it's just really important. So mom can be a much better mom. I think it's fair to say she's free to pursue, you know, her wishes in a way that she couldn't otherwise. And yeah, one of the things that we're really interested in is finding out if grandparenting is really a distinctive kind of role than parenting or other kinds of caretaking. So we humans are pretty good at helping one another out, whether it's a cousin or an aunt or, you know, whomever. So we have a general propensity and aptitude for helping relatives and friends. But we think for humans, grandparents are really something special. And one of the reasons is because we have this most unusual physiological event that happens in midlife, the climacteric and menopause. And it presents a real enigma, an evolutionary enigma. It's very difficult to explain why a mother would stop having babies. If evolution is about getting your genes into future generations, then how does stopping having babies result in your doing that better than if you continued to have another child or two or three? And, you know, that really points the finger at an older woman doing something besides taking care of her own child that is really important. And we think that, you know, that's one of the clues that there's really something special about human grandparenting, because there really aren't any other species that have that particular physiological event. There are some whales, pilot whales, but just like us, they have grandmothers that are in charge of the pod. And it's really important for them to be able to serve that role effectively. And elephants and chimpanzees sometimes tail off in terms of reproduction. And in both cases there, particularly elephants, the older matriarch can have a very important effect on whether her relatives survive or not. So it makes sense. It all kind of fits neatly. And
I
you
think
asked,
you're helping us understand that the grandparent is a very unique feature of human society.
that's the question. Yeah, you know, they really appear to be. But we like to have the smoking gun that grandparenting is different than just kind of lapsing into parenting again because you're around a baby, and it's just a general phenomenon. And
Right.
menopause looks like one of those smoking guns, but we're really interested in finding out the hormonal and the neurobiological patterns of grandparenting. So when we monitor oxytocin levels in a grandparent when they're interacting with their grandbabies, is it just a duplication of what they were up to when they were a mother, or is there something different? Is their mind set up differently to be a good grandparent? It's a hard question to get at empirically. Certainly interviewing grandmothers gives you a lot of insight, and most grandmothers say, yeah, no, it's different. It's definitely a different kind of thing. But to translate that into their having specially evolved psychological mechanisms and hormonal mechanisms that suit them, that are designed for the grandparent role, that's different than the parental role. You asked me about grandparents not living near their grandchildren in the Western industrialized world. It's a tough question. So I think sometimes, just like parenting, grandparenting can be psychologically stressful. So, if you've got a teenage grandchild, who's behaving in ways that you'd rather they didn't, that can be hard on you as a grandparent. So, on the other hand, the joy of having a positive influence over your grandchild, and coaxing them in one way or another into the high road, helping them develop virtues that will likely make for a better life for them. Grandparenting in and of itself is virtuous, I think, because it could be very sacrificing.
Interesting, very interesting. So you may be learning some, hopefully down the road, about the physiology of that particular kind of virtue.
That would be that'd be great if we could get there. It's not going to be easy, though.
I'm really glad, Mark, that we've got 10 more minutes with you. And I just want to mention, right now, we can't see your mouth. We can hear you very clear. I don't know if you can adjust. There you go. Now we can see you more fully.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
I'm so used to being masked. And, we tend to.
It's nice to see you. I'm sure there are people in the group here who would love to ask you some questions if you're up for it.
Oh, sure. Gosh, I miss you guys. When you said I've got a friend there, I've got lots of friends.
Yeah.
Bowen is about the friendliest group of people. And I mean friendly in a, what's the right way to define it? But just really nice to be around.
That's good to hear.
And I don't know if it's like self-selection, if nice people gravitate or if just being in that sort of mindset helps you become a better person.
I wonder, Bob or Lori or Priscilla, do you have a question you'd like to ask Mark?
Yeah, hi, Mark.
Hey, Bob.
The question of grandmothers is just so fascinating. And again, particularly in a village like the one that you've been working with for so many years, it's so evident the central role that grandmothers play. And then there are some families, even in that village, where the more immediate family gets more isolated from the larger families. There's not very many of them, but there are a few that do get more isolated. And I think you can see the impact on the children when those families get more isolated from the larger extended family. And you can really see this difference with, I think, grandmothers and their grandchildren in terms of the attachment that's there and the involvement. I mean, universally, I think. But I also thought the relationship, and I think he referred to that, the relationship with a grandmother with her own daughter, while her daughter's having kids, makes her a better mother. And it takes a lot of the pressure off of the kind of energy demands of being a mom that not having a grandmother would have. What are your thoughts about their grandmother's relationship with her daughter and children? Or I noticed that Eugenia just had a grandchild.
Yes, I was going to tell you the news. I feel like I'm a grandfather.
Congratulations.
Dwayne and my son Ricky are just, a couple of weeks apart, and we're really good friends. And well, anyway.
Well, I'm sure she's over the moon. But
yes.
What are your thoughts about the relationship with the grandmother and the impact of that on a mother having children?
Well, I think they're very important, and in human families, these extended families, it is in some ways an organization that has its own sort of collective interest. So, sorry, I've got to deal with my kitty cat here, who likes to talk to people. So sometimes the elder females will influence when the younger ones start reproducing, so that there aren't conflicts, so that the larger extended family is sort of optimally distributing its alloparental effort, if that makes sense. The older female relatives too are key links, a nexus that connect people. So as long as great-grandmother is alive, all of her descendants have got a route to interacting with one another through her. After she dies, then the factions tend to separate. And there are other things that can cause extended families to separate. I know you were extremely helpful to a few families that you counseled there who had those kinds of problems of kitty cat climbing up my blinds. Very, very naughty. I may have to throw her outside. Sorry, you guys.
She's not disturbing us.
The other thing I wanted to comment on was grandfathers. Grandfathers can be super important as well. And often it's in a slightly different domain, a more public domain. But things like status and connections for work and cooperation in regards to land and other kinds of economic activities, grandfathers can be super, super important.
I'd love to hear any detail about that, more detail about the specific features of those categories that you've noticed, Mark.
The categories?
Oh, just those features of grandparenting that you have noticed, how influential they are. Any details you have about that, if you have any more.
Gosh, yeah. Well, we could be days and days recanting, little vignettes of, gosh, when Dee Dee did this, the consequences that it had for, her grandchildren. And gosh, really the presence of the elders who have a lot of social power. And, if there's one thing that's a pretty big difference, living in the USA, the respect and the importance of the elders is greatly reduced compared to traditional societies. traditional societies like this community in Dominica, there's just a lot of respect for the word of the elders. And yeah, that can make
very,
for
very
a much more pro-social community. So yeah, when a young man or woman is getting a little bit out of line, the right word from the elders is pretty influential. Normally when you travel the world and you find yourself in communities in which there are great disparities, inequities in wealth, you will find individuals who don't have much, sometimes stealing resources from those that do. And, in this community in Dominica, in the 32 years I've been there, I've, just never encountered anything of that sort, which is pretty remarkable. The families honor that sort of stuff is really important still. And in a large industrialized digital age culture like ours, those relationships, they're just not there. My kids are interacting over the internet. They didn't grow up in a community in which everyone was a relative and everyone was looking out for them and knew who they were, and all their friends were enmeshed in this network as well. So it's very different. I think it generates a lot of business for you therapists. But how you might try and recapture some of that, that's a tough question. But I think as far as different approaches go, Bowen is just amazing. It certainly fits with my scientific perspective as being the right way to go.
There's a very, just a very fundamental feature of the Bowen theory that it views the multi-generational process as really important, and having, I think, just that simple focus. And many people have critiqued psychotherapy, as a historical thing that in many ways can be dangerous to multi-generational family connectedness at times. It can be divisive of that. And I think Bowen theory is one version of it that doesn't have that risk built into it. We're right at the end, Mark. And I just want to thank you again. I know you came in late, but don't worry about it. It was just great to be with you. And we actually had a really good talk before you came on about some of the things I remember and Bob remembers and Lori remembers about the findings you've had. So I just want to thank you for the work you've done. And I'm glad you're still doing it. And maybe we'll have to get you back, after. What would be a good time to get you back to hear some of what you discover here about this complex puzzle of the exact features of this grandparenting? Yeah.
Oh my.
Is that going to take a couple of years, or how long will that take?
It certainly could. Really?
Yeah. Well, you're so careful about what you do. So I understand that. So thanks again, Mark, and thanks for hanging with us, folks. Good to be with you, and stay tuned. We'll be doing something like this again soon.